Saul Hughes, Logan Crooks, Matt Glencross, Fran Anen, Noah Mason, Will Paul, and Jeff Zhao. Congratulations also to their instructor, Jonah Scott. It is with great pride that I commend him on the work and hope that this opportunity leads to a promising future in the exciting field for these talented students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The time allotted for member statements has expired, and we'll just pause briefly while we await QP. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the government's wait time website is described as helping you and your family doctor make informed choices. And then it lists wait times for important services and procedures in healthcare like addictions, treatment, mental health treatment, surgeries and MRIs. Mr. Speaker, an update to the wait time website is due this month, May of 2016. I'd like to ask the Premier if he can ensure that that website is updated with current wait times before this session, this spring session of the Legislature concludes.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he would know, I've been involved in a former government. Department of Health has a number of things on the go, but I'm sure that people in the Department of Health will ensure that that website is updated as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard to imagine how many things could be more important than updating the wait time website so that people know how long they're waiting, either for addiction services or for an MRI or other diagnostic testing, Mr. Speaker. But of course, that's only helpful if you actually have a family doctor. And of course, thousands of Nova Scotians don't even have a family doctor today, Mr. Speaker. The Premier promised a family doctor for every Nova Scotian, but we know there are thousands and thousands of people without a doctor today, Mr. Speaker, to help them. Mr. Speaker, they are waiting and waiting for that family doctor. Would the Premier agree to update the wait time website to include wait times in Nova Scotia for family doctors?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I think Nova Scotians are working with the Health Authority to ensure that we have the appropriate health care teams across our province to deliver primary health care services, Mr. Speaker, from one end of the province to the other. Since coming into government, we've invested over $8 million to deal with wait lists. Mr. Speaker, we had 1,400 more surgeries since coming in. I think there was about 500 more scheduled for last year. We're looking to have that increased, but we're working with our surgical teams across this province that is looking at the province not in a fractured way, but looking at a holistic way to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to improve and deliver services to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier might think everything is fine, but every day we hear another story about a Nova Scotia family that does not have a family doctor, and they call every day and they're told their doctors are not taking new patients or they're going to be taking new patients months from now, Mr. Speaker. The Premier promised every Nova Scotian family that they would have a doctor. If he truly meant that, he should not be concerned about publishing the actual wait times for getting a family doctor in this province. That all that they talk about they're putting into the system, Nova Scotians only care about what they're getting at the other end, and what they're not getting is a family doctor. So I'll ask, why not post wait times for family doctors so Nova Scotians can see for themselves what's really going on?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, no time did I say things are fine. What I've said, things are improving, Mr. Speaker. We're working very diligently with healthcare providers across this province to ensure that we put together the primary care healthcare teams that communities are looking for. Mr. Speaker, they're finding innovative ways through nurse practitioners, Mr. Speaker, along with physicians. Some are walking clinics, some are running practices, Mr. Speaker. Some are doing them in a collaborative way. Some are running them, Mr. Speaker, single practitioner working together, Mr. Speaker. So the healthcare teams are working with the District Health Authority to ensure that we can deal with primary healthcare needs of Nova Scotians, and we're going to continue to work with them. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest. We've invested over $50 million in home care to improve home care services. We've invested over $8 million in surgical times, Mr. Speaker, seeing 1,400 more gone up since coming into power, Mr. Speaker. We know there's more work to do, but we're going to continue to work with healthcare providers to provide that service to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, since the government took office in 2013, hospital infrastructure budgets have been significantly underspent. Across 3 budgets, there has been $146 million budgeted for hospital infrastructure, but only $72.6 million spent. Mr. Speaker, that means that less than half of the money budgeted has been spent. The former Deputy Minister has said, and I quote, "What I see looking through the numbers is that there's been a drastic reduction," and I table that. So I ask the Premier, why has his government been drastically underspending on hospital infrastructure?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, this is the same mistake the Honourable Member made when she talked about the housing budget. That money has been committed to projects, Mr. Speaker. That money has already been put out there. There have been delays, whether it's been through design or, Mr. Speaker, in terms of construction that's been there, but we have to account for that money. We need appropriate, Mr. Speaker, for us to tell any Nova Scotians we've already spent it when in actual fact the contract hasn't been done. As she would know, Mr. Speaker, I think she should know the investment we're making in Dartmouth General. Continue to make, Mr. Speaker, that is an ongoing project. Some of those are being done on time and they're laid out. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member. Mr. Speaker, she may not know this, Mr. Speaker, but the honourable member sitting next to her.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, she may not know this, but the honourable member sitting next to her is Minister of Health and sat on the file around the VG. We're moving forward, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we continue to build, Mr. Speaker, to make sure, Mr. Speaker,
order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to continue to invest. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure she understood and heard, Mr. Speaker, that we're opening the 3rd OR surgery down in Windsor, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can make sure we have access to surgical time outside the Valley, Mr. Speaker. We're capitalizing on the infrastructure. But we're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers across this province, continue to drive, making sure that we have the proper healthcare services in place.
The Honourable Leader now is for the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's really hard to ignore the facts on this, and Nova Scotians do not approve of trying to balance the budget by underspending a much-needed hospital infrastructure. The government is trying to give the impression there will be plenty of money spent on hospital infrastructure once a so-called review of projects is complete. However, Mr. Speaker, in this year's budget, there is only $34 million budgeted for hospital infrastructure, as compared to $42 million last year. So I ask the Premier, if there will be more work done this year, why is the hospital infrastructure budget $8 million less than it was last year?
Just want to remind the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid that a load of baloney, quote-unquote, actually was ruled unparliamentary by this Speaker here on December 4th, 2015. The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member. I want to thank the honourable member. Question takes me back to my childhood, Mr. Speaker. I remember when my mother used to buy that bologna that had the wax around it. You could cut it off and you could fry it. It was a wonderful time when we could see that, Mr. Speaker. But I do want to answer the question, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to work with contractors across the province, continuing to work with healthcare teams to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to invest in healthcare infrastructure. Very encouraged by the announcement we made around the QE2, Mr. Speaker. Encouraged by what's happening in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, that's moving forward on time, making sure, Mr. Speaker, that the healthcare clinicians across this province have the infrastructure they require. We know there's more work to do. We're going to continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, in a consistent, thoughtful way, so we look at the province in its totality, Mr. Speaker, instead of the fractured way that it was done before.
The Honourable Leader now is for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a minute to return to an unanswered question yesterday. Yesterday, my colleague asked the Minister of the Environment 3 times if the Brooklyn Quarry had been approved, but she could not answer the question. So given that it's in the Premier's writing, perhaps he knows the answer. So I ask the Premier, has the Brooklyn Quarry been approved?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank her for giving me the opportunity to stand up and talk about the constituents of Annapolis. Mr. Speaker, it is the birthplace of this country. I'm looking forward to taking the Premier's here, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member, since being elected, there's been a quarry sited directly behind my house, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell her that there's a proponent who offered on the Brooklyn Quarry, Mr. Speaker. There was an incomplete application that was brought forward, Mr. Speaker. There was a number of extensions on that application. The proponent did not bring all the information to the Department of Environment. They have an obligation, Mr. Speaker, if the proposal is incomplete, to reject it, Mr. Speaker. That is before the courts right now. But there's an opportunity for anyone If they want to apply for a future query on that site, it is still there, Mr. Speaker. The only reason that query was rejected was based on the fact that it was an incomplete application that was brought before the department.
I'd just like to remind the Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party that the theme of her line of questioning should remain consistent and not jump from one topic to another inside the supplementary. So, just for future reference, the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. We learned last week that Atlantic Lottery Corporation is now renting space at Volta Labs. Mr. Speaker, a spokesperson for the lottery company said that they are particularly excited about gaining access to the province's top gaming talent. Mr. Speaker, this is another step towards introducing online gambling here in the province of Nova Scotia from a government that already is relying on gambling revenue in their budget, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier very directly, will you tell us today, is his government preparing to introduce online gambling, government-sponsored in the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that file is not with me, Mr. Speaker, but I want to tell the honourable member how excited I am about what's happening at Volta, how excited I am, Mr. Speaker, at young Nova Scotians. Young Nova Scotians are providing job opportunities in this province, Mr. Speaker, continuing to work, ensuring that they take their first opportunity to entrepreneurship in Nova Scotia. We're seeing private sector investment, Mr. Speaker, not only at Volta, we're seeing it in Ocean Park, Mr. Speaker, looking forward that to continue to grow, and how excited, Mr. Speaker, the private sector is finally seeing a government in Atlantic Canada that recognizes we can do anything in this part of the country that they can do anywhere else in the world.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and let's let Volta do their thing, but not direct them to raising more money from gambling for the government of Nova Scotia. Let's let them do wonderful things, but not that, Mr. Speaker. It's the last thing we need. This is a government that already spent over $100,000 studying online gambling, Mr. Speaker, and now the gambling company, ALC, is co-located with Volta Labs, and are excited about getting access to that talent, Mr. Speaker. But the Premier, he can clear this all up. Will he make it clear to Atlantic Lottery Corporation that his government has no interest in getting into the online gambling business?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll have the Minister responsible for that to respond.
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Gaming Act.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that Atlantic Lotto is reviewing the issue of online gaming with all of our partners in the Atlantic provinces. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition may be aware that there are already several Canadian provinces that do regulate online gaming. In fact, I believe they represent approximately 80% of the Canadian population is already under a system of regulated online gaming. Currently, online gaming in Nova Scotia is not regulated. There is no means of knowing if it is causing problem gaming. It is being done by offshore companies that have no jurisdiction here in this province. Again, there is research that is being done. It has been a very structured approach, and is our Atlantic Lotto's intention of having all 4 Atlantic provinces look at this together. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Halifax, there's a lot of concerned residents who meet on a regular basis, especially over the last number of months, to talk about affordable housing in Halifax, and specifically around the north end of Halifax, Mr. Speaker. These community members know how important it is to address affordable housing, and they see an expansion of businesses tearing down residents that potentially could have been used for affordable housing. So I'm wondering if the Minister of Community Services could indicate to those citizens in the north end of Halifax and on the peninsula what the government is doing specifically to increase the availability of affordable housing in the downtown area and the north end of Halifax.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the member for the question. I'm very proud of the record of this government in investing $42 million over the last couple of years from the deferred federal contribution. Of that $42 million, $10 million was actually set aside for 300 rent supplements. So what we've seen because of that over the last 18 months, the wait list has actually decreased by almost 600 people, because that's the fastest way to move people off the wait list. We've also worked very closely with the Brunswick Street Board, and we will be announcing something in the very future about the nonprofit society there. And we're also working with our private partners in Dartmouth North and other areas of HRM, because we know that affordable housing is an issue within this jurisdiction.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the government has put a lot into rent subsidy, but ownership of stock in the province, I think, is something the government is not going towards and not trying to increase. It's like renting a house. You don't get the equity in the end for the homeowner. So I think the government needs to look at opportunities to increase the stock that we have in Nova Scotia. Halifax North End is also in desperate need of affordable housing options, as I said. It's been more than 3 years since the province won the bid to develop Bloomfield to create hundreds of spaces of affordable housing, Mr. Speaker. We're hearing rumours now of the Premier is pulling out of the Bloomfield development project in the government. So I'd like to ask the Premier a very direct and simple question. Is the government pulling out of the Bloomfield development project?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member Bourneau, the honourable member talked about affordable housing. There's many options across this province. We're working with our partners, both government and private sector partners, Mr. Speaker, to deliver affordable housing options. Mr. Speaker, if our government is going to do anything around Bloomfield, we'll communicate that with them, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with the options that were before us to make sure that we deal with the issue of affordable housing. I've said many times, I think it's the single biggest thing that government can do in terms of helping low-income Nova Scotians is to work towards an affordable housing strategy that gives many options, the many varied options that are required to provide housing to citizens of this province.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the shortage of doctors in Cape Breton is threatening the health and safety of island families. Just months after it opened, the orphan clinic is no longer accepting patients because the doctors can't keep up with the demand. Mr. Speaker, there's a crisis in health care on Cape Breton Island. My question to the Minister is exactly how many Cape Bretoners have been turned away from the orphan clinic? And would the Minister please supply that number to the House today?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And those are numbers that probably the Health Authority would have. I don't have here at my fingertips. We'll work on that this morning. But what I'd like to tell the member opposite and all those in Cape Breton, the success of recruiting doctors for Neils Harbour, Badek, we'll build on that in the coming months.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, we know that there are some doctors coming. We also know, Mr. Speaker, that it's going to take a while for that to happen. And what about the people today that need a doctor? You know, Mr. Speaker, the orphan clinic, which only opened a few months ago, is already closed its doors to taking new patients. When it started, the orphan clinic, Mr. Speaker, had 9 doctors. Today it has 2. When it had 9 doctors, it was booked until August. Now there are only 2 doctors. So who knows when, if at any time, these people are going to get an appointment. Can the Minister please tell us what the current wait time is for those who need care at the orphan clinic? Mr. Speaker, it's a crisis.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The orphan clinic obviously plays a role, as I stated on CBC Cape Breton earlier this week. Cape Breton has an anomaly currently due to the downturn in the oil industry. We've had a tremendous return of Cape Bretoners to all of Cape Breton and to Sydney,
Please, the Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
And we need to keep that in perspective as the Health Authority is making recruitment for Cape Breton the number one priority. 10 doctors, 10 more in the recruitment process.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Recently, Mr. Speaker, we learned that Health and Wellness underspent last year's hospital infrastructure budget by some $26.888 million. This when there are so many huge infrastructure needs in the province, including a very badly needed dialysis and hospice in the Valley, and the minister has promised these in the past. Can the minister explain why his department saw so few needs in hospital infrastructure that nearly 2/3 of the budget for hospital infrastructure was not spent last year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to address that question. I've learned, like all health ministers, that projects are delayed for a whole number of reasons. We have situations ready to spend several millions of dollars. There are some legal issues that will get in the way, and then practice changes with the input of clinicians. And we go back to redesign. That's what happened in a number of cases. I'm excited about a lot of projects across the province that will roll out over the next couple of years.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that answer. My response to that is simply work. You have to do the work. And can the minister assure this House and the citizens of Kings North that the budget for this year will be spent, and one of the items in the budget's a dialysis building for the Valley Regional? Can the minister assure this House and my constituents that they intend to, he and his department will spend this money?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, we have millions of dollars going out for hospital construction, whether it's the Aberdeen, whether it's the community hospital in Guysborough, work at a number of facilities across the province. As the member opposite knows very well, the original design was looking at a two-floor addition to Valley Regional that would have had a floor for hospice, a floor for the dialysis unit. That has now all changed, as hospice will be a standalone facility, and that project is moving along. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage sent out a media release which bragged about the contribution of culture to Nova Scotia's GDP and jobs. And while I certainly support the highlighting of the creative industry's contribution to our economy, I'd like to point out that when we checked the link provided in the Minister's release, we learned that between 2013 and 14 there was actually a drop of 1.8% in culture-related jobs and only a minimal increase in GDP. And this was when the Liberals became government. So my question for the minister is, would he agree today that the cultural sector's jobs actively decreased between 2013 and 14?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you for that question or statement, actually. This new data that Stats Canada provides us gives us and all Nova Scotians a clearer understanding of the economic importance of culture and sport in our province. Those numbers for 2013-2014 are projections, and Stats Canada uses those as indicators. Those projections show both an increase in jobs and money to the GDP. I will say to you that if you have any questions regarding these numbers, reach out to Stats Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Stats Canada's numbers clearly show that the trend between 2010 and 2013 in Nova Scotia was an increase in jobs in the cultural section and GDP while the NDP was in power. So perhaps the minister meant to thank the government of the day for the sector's contribution to the economy during those years. On behalf of the NDP, I'd like to say you're very welcome, and keeping in mind that current numbers do not reflect the changes resulting from the 2015 elimination of the film tax credit, will the minister please confirm his intention to use these 2014 numbers as a baseline going forward?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
First of all, let me say to you, thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you look at the trend from 2013 to 2016, if you look at the numbers from 2010 to 2016, there is an increase. There is an increase. There is an increase. So I'd like to thank the NDP for giving us this pleasure of talking about the good numbers that we produce. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in his reply to my last question, the Minister talked about all the influx of people coming back from Alberta as part of the reason we have a doctor shortage in the Cape Breton Island. But I would like to inform the Minister and all the members of this House that there are a number of senior citizens who have not had doctors for years, for the last 2 and 3 years in Cape Breton Island, because there are no doctors for them. For him to stand here and use that as an excuse in a long line of excuses of not living up to the real truth of the matter, there is a crisis in doctors in Cape Breton Island. So I would like the Minister to explain how an influx of people from Alberta has had an impact on the senior citizens of this province that haven't been able to get a doctor in 2 and 3 and 4 years' time.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Since this has been an issue here in the House over the last few days, I went back and reviewed the situation over a decade, and we don't see a great deal of difference. Every now and then there's an area of the province that has more retirements than usual of doctors or sudden departures from practice. What I know is that Cape Breton and a few other areas of the province are now the highest priority to add to the 10 doctors that have been recruited.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, 10 doctors have been recruited. Yes, they're looking for 10 more doctors. And yes, there's more doctors leaving every day because of the policies that have been put in place by this government. Now, the question is, are we to live in hopes of what might happen? What are you going to tell the people who do not have a doctor today, who haven't had a doctor for months? What are you going to tell them, Mr. Speaker? What is the minister and this government who promised every Nova Scotian would have a doctor? What are you going to tell them that they can't get a doctor, they can't go and get a health report? What is this minister really going to say to those people who cannot get a doctor, do not have a doctor, and he's doing nothing about it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising a very important question that affects Nova Scotians. What I can say is that recruitment has gone well. We'll see the introduction of more nurse practitioners. What all Nova Scotians now are starting to realize is that that medical practice has changed. They're talking about primary care delivery by a wide variety of primary care clinicians.
The honourable member for Colchester Musquedominant Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. My questions are going to be very similar to the member from Sackville-Cobequid. There are, in estimates, we found out that the wait list for public housing is huge. Seniors, families are waiting for placements, are waiting for some transfers. So would the minister tell us again what the department is doing to address the wait list for seniors and families who are waiting for placement?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the member for the question. Over the last number of years, there has been increases in different areas of the wait list. The family lists go down because most of the units, most of the 12,000 units that are available in Nova Scotia for subsidized housing are actually family units. So we find a lot of seniors who now are leaving their homes and looking for affordable housing are on the wait list. And so I'm very pleased to say that over the next couple of years, in partnership with CMHC and the federal government, there are dedicated funds for the new builds of seniors housing, and we really hope to alleviate some of the wait list in that demographic.
The honourable member for Colchester Musquedominant Valley.
Just another part of this. In correspondence from public accounts, they provided details about the wait list by region. In eastern mainland, my region, there are 278 families with approved applications, 485 approved seniors waiting for placement. There are also 419 current tenants approved for transfers. So what can the department do to make people aware of the opportunities to move into a housing unit that is better suited for their needs?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's an excellent question. We often try to mirror and reflect the needs of people who are in social housing right now with what their actual needs are. Many people right now are currently overhoused. We have housing authority staff in all 5 regions reaching out to people who are overhoused to help them move into the community by providing a wide array of tools that we have in our toolbox, such as rent supplements, so that we can move people off that wait list. I'm pleased with the 600 people family movement in the last 18 months. It's the largest movement on that wait list in the last decade, but there is more to be done, and we'll be working with people to help them find adequate housing within their communities through the tools that we have at Housing Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, my first question is for the Acting Minister of Environment. I have been contacted by a local resident from the Wildcat Reserve in Queens County who keeps horses. He told me that the provincial enforcement officers have been showing up asking questions about his activities. The resident is concerned that under federal law, these officers have no jurisdictions to be on the reserve. Mr. Speaker, so I asked the Acting Minister of Environment, on what grounds are these enforcement officers going on the Wildcat Reserve?
The Honourable Acting Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that certainly is a specific local question, and we'll have the Minister of the Environment address this next week.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my second question is for the Minister of Agriculture. I have heard from yet another resident who keeps cattle and oxen. He has been advised that he is now required to report if he transports his animals even for a short distance. He is concerned that these permits are just more red tape that previously did not exist. So I asked the Minister, Mr. Speaker, of Agriculture.
Order, please. Can the member confirm this is the same theme as... Okay. Sorry, please proceed. The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, so I asked the Minister of Agriculture, can he provide any comments on this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
I'm presently not aware of that situation. I will investigate it and get back to the member.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, our province has numerous provincial parks and beaches. Local residents and tourists continue to enjoy the spectacular beaches and beautiful scenery. However, visitors and employees at these parks and beaches continue to suggest that a lack of funding to maintain these areas is of major concern. My question to the Minister, will the Minister admit that the infrastructure in several parks and beaches has been ignored during the past 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. Quite the contrary, Mr. Speaker. The Department is very proud of the commitment we have to our over 200 parks and the over 1 million visits that we have to those parks every year. We have a robust schedule of maintenance, and it is a challenge in the province because we are working with nature to keep these parks going. But we have a significant commitment, and our staff work very hard with the public to keep these parks vibrant. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, fading weight trail markers, fallen trees, erosion, deteriorating pavement, eroding sand dunes appear to be of concern. In some areas, lack of maintenance are causing potential safety concerns. My question to the Minister, will the Minister commit today to providing the necessary funding to upgrade our provincial parks and beaches?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. We are committing significant funding to our beaches and our parks, and we're working with all the ENGOs who help us a lot in terms of determining what's going on. And sometimes things like changing dunes are natural features that are welcomed in the process. Erosion is a consideration, and I guess, in the history of the Earth, when you see a change that happens over our memory and our time compared to the millions of years that the Earth is being around, we should take that into consideration when we're making statements about how the sky is falling. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, Newcastle has been the company providing management services for Digby Pines and Liscombe Lodge since 2002. Operations cost the province more than $1.5 million a year. Our office has been trying to find out the management fee, which is done through a contract and is public information. His department officials have not been forthcoming with this information. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is, will the minister confirm how the Newcastle management fee is being paid out? Is it a cut of revenue, a management fee, or some other way? And will he provide the House with a breakdown and a total of these costs in the past 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. I'm certainly aware of the circumstances around Newcastle and the services that they're providing and the management of those facilities. The revenues that are expended to them for that service, I will obtain and be prepared certainly to share with my colleague. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, the management fees of those facilities over the last 10 years have decreased, and the fees are at the lowest they've ever been over the past 10 years under this present government.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I thank Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for that answer, and I look forward to seeing those numbers. Another issue has been the potential sale or the effort to sell these to Liscombe Lodge, and I have in front of me a document which we received through FOIPOP, and I will just quote from it. The offer from, and this is redacted out, blank, includes keeping the property operating as a resort. They have not requested financial assistance from the province and have offered $1 as a purchase price. The offer also includes a request for additional lands totaling close to 90,000 acres outside the Liscombe Lodge lands. And it's not clear whether this offer has been accepted or rejected, but will the minister confirm he's not giving away the farm when he puts these facilities up for sale? 90,000 acres is a lot of land.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to assure my colleague that we're certainly not going to give away the farm. That's the very point of the discussions we're having with proponents, Mr. Speaker. There's people that believe the government will give in and give the farm away, and that's not the case. I've said before, both in this House and externally, Mr. Speaker, we will have the best interests of Nova Scotians at heart. And my colleague from Pictou, who continues to chirp, Mr. Speaker, certainly this continues to be distractions for Nova Scotians. What I will tell the House, Mr. Speaker, this government has the best interest of Nova Scotians in mind.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, Mr. Speaker, families in Cape Breton are facing the closure of 17 schools, and responsibility for many of these aging buildings has been downloaded onto the municipalities. But meanwhile, 2 of the schools built using the P3 model have been well maintained using public funds, and they'll have the keys handed over to private developers. So my question is for the Minister of Education. Is she satisfied to be leaving municipalities with bills for unwanted buildings while private developers walk away with a tidy profit?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. If the member understood the process, she would know that pre-1982 buildings, when they're no longer used by the school board for educational purposes, do revert back to the municipality.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Tribal Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I seem to feel an ongoing theme here today, which is people don't like to answer the questions. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking how she feels about the money going to private developers instead of keeping up the schools that are in these municipalities and closing a number of small rural schools. Now, many of these schools are aging and need maintenance, so the province is providing millions to make sure these schools by developers are kept up to date. So can the minister please just tell Nova Scotians why their money is going to private developers rather than public schools?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I am prepared to tell Nova Scotians and what Nova Scotians like about this government is that we have identified education and our students as a priority, and we will continue to do that.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia mink farmers are struggling. Market prices are down due to decreased demand and increased competition from China and Russia. The price per pelt was between $100 and $130 in 2014, and now those pelts are only getting $30 to $40, and I will table that. My question to the minister is, what steps have the government taken, or his government taken, to increase the viability of the mink industry during this difficult time?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question of the mink industry of the province of Nova Scotia. As the member will be aware, and I'm sure he's aware, that the sale of mink furs on the international market goes in a 10-year cycle. And we're at the bottom of the 10-year cycle now, and indeed the price is very low at the present time, but there is an indication with the auctions that are going on at the present time that the prices are on the way up again.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a CBC article points out that 25% of the workers in the mink industry are being laid off. The mink industry is very important to the southwest region of Nova Scotia. It's said to create as many as 1,200 direct jobs. In a local Express article released March 2nd, which I'll table, the President of the Association representing mink farmers said in many cases there is a $20 bill or greater difference between what mink are selling for and what it costs to raise one. Last year alone, we raised 2.3 million mink in the province. You start doing the math, there's a lot of money being lost. My question for the minister is this. Has the minister worked with the Minister of Business to develop a plan to instill confidence in lenders so the mink industry can overcome the downturn?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we've been working with the mink industry, their association, very closely. We believe we're getting close to making an arrangement with them to ensure that we can not only make the industry survive, but also that we can make sure that the industry will survive this kind of downturn in the future when it comes in another 10 years.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour. Jobs are very hard to come by, and people who have them really want to keep them because they depend on that to pay their bills. I cite one case where a man who had seniority had his hours cut, and younger ones were picking up those hours. Another lady, after 25 years, was laid off with no severance. My question is, are there any labour laws that protect these people, or are they just at the mercy of employers?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for bringing forward this question. Any worker that feels they have been unjustly treated at work can contact our Labour Standards Division, and I wish I had the 1-800 number off the top of my head. It's 1-888 something, but I can absolutely provide that to the honourable member. I would also point out there is legislation that protects employees who have been hired for longer than a 10-year period. So again, the Labour Standards folks would be happy to walk those folks through that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Actually, that also answered my second question. If there's something in place, then please, would you get me that information, or just contact them? Is it on the website? Okay, very good. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Before the end of today's session, I'll make sure he has the link and the phone number for his constituents to contact. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the North End Community Health Centre provides important health care and health promotion programs to nearly 5,000 residents in the North End of Halifax. Back in January, the centre told the Nova Scotia Health Authority it needed financial support or help to replace the roof and fix a number of ongoing structural issues with their building. The centre already fundraises and uses grants funding that's available, but is unable to meet these costs of the repairs. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister provide us an update on the situation at the North End Clinic?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to commend all the clinicians, the board, for the outstanding primary care to wraparound service that the North End Clinic provides. We're currently in an exploration process to look at their future. It's definitely a clinic that must remain part of the community, but what will be the physical structure, that simply remains part of the current investigation. But I can assure all those who use the wonderful service of the North End Clinic that they will have a strong future.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Well, I'm sure the residents of North End will be glad to hear that answer. But whatever the future holds, if it means a new building or not, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that's where the Minister's going, the repairs are needed today, yesterday, last week. So I'm wondering if the Minister, a direct question, will the government provide funding to fix the roof and some of the structure issues today so that the future of this clinic will still be there to serve the North End of Halifax?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's one of those situations where are we putting good money after something that may be very temporary in terms of the present location. What I can say is that the Health Authority, Department of Health, are working as quickly as possible to identify what could be another building or what their future relocation will look like.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we've had a number of discussions in this House about the quality of health care in the Cape Breton Island area and indeed all of rural Nova Scotia. There has been many questions raised about the current doctor situation and the shortage of doctors for seniors and others in Cape Breton Island. My question to the Premier is, will he direct his Minister of Health to take this matter seriously and deal with it directly today?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The Minister of Health identified to all members of this House this was a top priority for the Health Authority, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with communities across this province. As the honourable member would know, the Minister of Health has said a number of times they've recruited 10 physicians. There are more recruitment ongoing, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to make sure that we work with our partner in the Health Authority to make sure that we have frontline healthcare providers across our province.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, there is recruitment going on, but does anybody understand from that side of the House that these people are not going to be taking their jobs, some of them for 10 to 18 months from now? And yet there's a current shortage of doctors today that patients need help with. So my question to the Premier is quite simple. If this Minister of Health will not address the problem, will he put someone in the position to actually do the work?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The Minister of Health has answered this question many times in this House. There are 10 physicians coming into Cape Breton Island. We know we're going to continue to work to provide more, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to work with communities across this province to ensure. I understand 5 of those 10, Mr. Speaker, have taken tuition relief, a program we put in place. We're going to continue to work with those, Mr. Speaker, with the university, Mr. Speaker, at medical school to ensure that we continue to put in place practices that will keep the young people here, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable member, when he's getting a positive response to the question he asked, not satisfied with the fact that more doctors are coming to Kiberatin Island. We're going to continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to go forward. It's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, when we're continuing to see results for the citizens of this province, for the citizens of Kiberatin Island, Mr. Speaker. Those are positive things, Mr. Speaker, regardless of what political party puts that in. We shouldn't let politics interfere with the fact that we need to get medical people on the ground across this province, including Kiberatin Island. And when it's happening, Mr. Speaker, they should be recognized and be thankful, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Health is responding to the neglect that has taken place before he became the Minister of Health.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to give credit to the Premier for finally identifying and answering a question. This is an issue that is very important to all Nova Scotians. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue about getting people on the ground today to look after the people today, not, as the Premier said, down the road, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg has the floor.
I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that yes, these doctors are coming in the summer, but actually, people have health care needs today and they don't have a doctor. And I can tell you from personal experience that within 24 hours your life can take an altering change and have an effect on you right away. So when is this government going to admit that there is a real shortage on the ground of doctors and they need to be there today?
The Honourable Premier. Please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for third reading?
Now call public bills for third reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 156, the Public Archives Act?
Now call Bill number 156, the Public Archives Act. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 156, Amendments to the Public Archives Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, I thank those who spoke to this bill in second reading for their support of the amendments. I thank the archives, history, and genealogical communities for working with us. They help to ensure that our legislation does a good job in serving an important heritage institution. I would also like to thank my department staff who worked with stakeholders on the amendments. The amendments are primarily housekeeping in nature.